everybody, I'm Tall.
And I'm Small.
And today we're doing Khan Academy's Cells section, Cell Theory Questions. That was a kind of a tongue twister. All right, question number 1. Which of the following is not a premise of cell theory? 1. All cells arise from other cells. 2. All living cells require water for survival. And 3. All living things are only composed of cells. So is it 1 only, 2 only, 1 and 2, or 2 and 3? So Small, you recently taught me about cell theory because I haven't heard about it in a very long time.
Yes, this is one of the things that I reviewed in those review books that you can get from a number of different companies. And I hadn't gone over this since Bio 1. And the 3 tenets of cell theory is that all living things are comprised of cells. I don't know if they're only comprised of cells.
I wouldn't think so.
Sounds like a pigeonhole answer. That cells only arise from pre-existing cells, so that spontaneous generation, that was hard to say, idea that people thought of in like the Middle Ages is not a thing, and that the cell is the basic functioning unit of life. It takes in nutrients and expels waste.
So based on that, all living cells require water for survival. That is not in the tenets of cell theory.
Yep.
It could be true, but it's
Right.
not in the tenets of cell theory. All cells arise from other cells. That was explicitly
Totally
one
true.
of them. And then all living things are only composed of cells. I'm going to say no to that one because like fats and proteins, like we have other things in us that are not cells.
Yes, definitely. And if they had like 1 and 3 was an answer, maybe that would be a little tricky, because if you remembered cell theory, that does sound like one of them. But remembering that only and always are really pigeonhole answers.
So with here, I would go with 1 only, which is all cells arise from other cells. Oh, it's not.
Oh no.
Oh my gosh. What the heck is it then? Wait a minute. We just fell for the cardinal sin of the MCAT. Everybody listening, which of the following is not a premise of cell theory?
Oh no.
All living cells require water for survival, and all living things are only composed of cells are both not premises of cell theory. Wow, we fell right into that one.
Oh my goodness. Fellow pre-meds, please learn from our mistake.
Read the question. Okay, question number 2. Cell theory states
Goodness.
that all living cells must have a cell wall, all living cells require glucose for survival, or that the basic unit of life is a cell. So based on what we just learned, 3 would be the only one that the cell theory states, because the word not is not in this question. And sure enough, that was the correct answer. It's only that cells are the basic unit of life. Okay, question number 3. What did Schleiden and Schwann both discover individually? I like saying Schleiden. Okay, what did Schleiden and Schwann both discover individually? That all living things engage in metabolic functions, that all living things are composed of 1 or more cells, that all cells have organelles, or that spontaneous generation of cells is an incorrect theory. I do not know. I suppose Schwann might have led to Schwann cells.
Right.
So based on that, I'm going to say all cells have organelles. I'll bet that was before. Oh, wait, no. All cells don't have organelles. Do prokaryotes? Do they have organelles, or is it just not membrane-bound organelles?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. But well, they have ribosomes, right? So that counts. That's an organelle.
Yeah. Okay. But that one just doesn't feel right to me.
Yeah, and this sounds pretty early on.
All living things are composed of 1 or more cells? Maybe. All living things engage in metabolic functions? Maybe. Spontaneous generation of cells is an incorrect theory. That could be a 2. I'm just going to go with all living things engage in metabolic functions.
Okay, I'm going to pull I have no idea, and go with spontaneous generation, because I know something about that.
Okay.
And I wish I could remember the name of the scientist that figured it out. So maybe it's these people.
1, 2, 3. Oh, I got it wrong.
Oh, I did too.
I'll bet it's all living things. Yep, all living things are composed of 1 or more cells. Okay, so Schleiden and Schwann, let's learn about them. They observed plant and animal cells respectively. Schleiden and Schwann did not fully understand the concept of cells arising from other cells, so for them, in their time, spontaneous generation was still an acceptable theory. Together, Schleiden and Schwann agreed that if both plants and animals are made up of cells, then all living things are composed of cells.
Okay.
Okay, Schleiden and Schwann, everything is composed of cells. All living things. All right, next question. What did Louis Pasteur's crooked neck flask experiment disprove? That spontaneous generation is a method for creation of new cells, that the cell is the basic unit of life, that all living organisms are composed of cells, or that most cells require oxygen in order to survive.
This is like my favorite example of experimental design, because the scientists of Pasteur's time gave him just so much trouble when he was designing this whole process. So he used that crooked neck flask to show, he wanted to show that you could start with sterile media and have no growth, because there was not just growth that spouted out of the media itself.
Right.
His theory was that, there was already something growing, and somehow that little thing growing got into a media food source and continued to grow to the point where eventually you would see something. So he would like boil the media, and then they were like, well, you killed the vital life force of whatever could produce life. And then he was like, okay, let me not boil the media. And he used like it was open to the air, and then he was in one version of it, he closed it off from the air, and they were like, well, the air is also part of the vital life force. And so his idea to fix all of these different criticisms was that he could boil the media, and he could leave like a long tube that went down to the ground and then was open at the bottom, that would require something to like crawl up into, which he thought like dust and different particles and bacteria and stuff wouldn't do. And so he allowed air to get to it, and he didn't like boil it so much that they claimed that he would kill like any possibility of life being in it.
Right.
And therefore proved that like that the generation of life and like growth in media has to come from some pre-existing cell, and it couldn't just spontaneously generate from the media.
Right. So based on that that story, we would see that the correct answer to what did Louis Pasteur's crooked neck flask experiment disprove, it disproved that spontaneous generation is a method for the creation of new cells.
Yes, and it's been too long since I've taken micro, and that was probably a really bad telling of the story, but it just was one of my favorite like experimental designs too, because he used all these different controls to show what would happen if he didn't do such and such thing. And it was just really well done. It was like a beautiful, elegant experiment.
And it led to one of the three tenets of cell theory, which is that cells arrive from only pre-existing cells.
Exactly.
Very cool. And we got it right. All right, next question. In a histology lab, a scientist observes the following features under the microscope. Which of these observations supports cell theory? Is it cardiac cells are joined by gap junctions and contain 3 nuclei? Mature platelet cells do not contain a nucleus, but do contain mitochondria? Spermatogonia undergoing mitosis? Or the bulk of tissue samples from endocrine glands contain cells as their main building blocks? Okay, so we have the choice of the second one only, the first and third, the second and fourth, or the third and fourth. So let's go through these one at a time and see if they follow one of the three tenets of cell theory. So cardiac cells are joined by gap junctions and contain 3 nuclei. That doesn't really support cell theory.
Yeah, not at all. It's just a fact about some cells.
Yeah, it's an observation. So then mature platelet cells do not contain a nucleus, but do contain mitochondria?
Not really.
Yeah. Yeah, you could maybe, that would almost, nah, that's nothing. That couldn't really be spun. And that's important to know in the MCAT, that if you really have to like try to use like theory to answer a question, especially one like this, you're probably thinking too hard. Spermatogonia undergoing mitosis.
Yes.
Definitely. That would be that cells arise only from pre-existing cells. And then what about the bulk of tissue samples from endocrine glands contain cells as their main building blocks? Yeah.
Yep.
That would be that all living things are composed of cells.
So we ruled out the first one, and the only other answer that includes 3 would be the 3 and 4, and those were the two.
Right.
that we thought were viable.
Yeah, absolutely. And we check it, and we're right.
So really quickly, just because it's such a cool thing, I wanted to talk about how cool the differentiation from Spermatogonia is to mature spermatozoa, I think is the final form.
Maybe.
Okay, but so it's in the seminiferous tubules in the testes, and at their most basal layer, they are spermatogonia.
Mm-hmm.
But as they start differentiating, they rise up through the layers, and by the time they it's almost as if the cells part for them, like the Red Sea. And the spermatozoa, when they're fully mature, they just leave into the seminiferous tubules, and then they get stored in the epididymis, and just how those cells differentiate is so cool.
It's also really important to know for MCAT stuff. I've seen many discrete questions, and I think even passages that require you to know the pathway that both male and female gametes undergo, and how that gets involved in possible birth defects or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So knowing those pathways is very important. Okay, next question. Which of the following is a potential exception to cell theory? Mitochondria, fungal spores, amoebas, or asexual reproduction? Okay, it wouldn't be asexual reproduction because that still is cells arising from other cells.
Yeah, the cell theory doesn't say anything about we have to have genetic variation.
Right. What about amoebas?
Wow, they're just throwing some shade at amoebas.
I know. I don't know why it wouldn't be amoebas. What about fungal spores?
All I can think of are bacterial endospores. I'm not quite sure what, is it what are fungal spores?
I think fungal spores, that's that's kind of like I think it's kind of like a bacterial spore. It's I think of it like pollen.
Yeah, okay, so it's almost a gamete, maybe.
Yeah,
For
it
the
might
fungus.
it might be like a self-fertilizing gamete though.
Okay, it's still creating life from a different life source of
I
cells.
think so. Yeah.
So
Mitochondria? Mitochondria.
That endosymbiont theory,
Yeah.
that one anaerobic bacteria engulfed an aerobic bacteria.
Right.
Kind of plays right along with cell theory that cells arise from different cells.
Well, if we're thinking though that it's not a cell, but mitochondria replicate themselves, right?
Yes.
But they're not considered living cells.
Oh, in and of themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would lean towards that.
But so what are we saying that one goes against?
That all cells arise from pre-existing cells? I don't know. Or what about, okay, so all living things are composed of cells. Asexual reproduction doesn't counter that. Amoebas don't counter that. Fungal spores, that doesn't counter that.
I'm going to go with mitochondria too, just because we know that they carry some DNA of their own, and so they're an exception in a good many ways.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll go with that and then read the hits.
Okay. Hey, we got it right.
Yay! Okay, now why?
Yes. Okay, cell theory states cells are the basic unit of life. Living organisms are composed of one or more cells, and that cells came from pre-existing cells. Asexual reproduction does not violate any of these tenets because asexual reproduction is the process of one cell becoming two. Okay. Mitochondria are thought to be ancestors of endosymbiotic organisms. Mitochondria replicate by dividing and have their own DNA. In many ways, mitochondria function as cells inside of our cells. This is the only option out of the four that might be considered an exception to cell theory.
Okay, so we were on the right lines.
Yeah.
So if you've got a question that's not really making a whole bunch of sense to you and you're really not sure what they're asking, go with your gut, mark it, and then if you have time at the end, maybe come back with a clear head and attempt to do it again. I've had a couple of questions like that where I just wasn't sure what they were asking me the first time I read it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was, worried about time, and it's a little bit of a stressful situation, so you're not thinking super clearly.
Right.
So just mark it and come back to it if you can, and maybe it'll make more sense the second time you read it.
Yeah. I'm starting to learn the value of just marking the questions as well.
Yeah.
All right, next question. Viruses infect cells and replicate themselves by utilizing various enzymes and cellular components of their host cell. Could you apply the same tenets of cell theory to viral replication? Okay, so is the answer no, viruses do not strictly adhere to cell theory because they are not living organisms. No, viruses do not strictly adhere to cell theory because viruses do not directly come from other viruses. They require an intermediate cell to replicate. Yes, viruses strictly adhere to cell theory because an individual virus is a singular cellular unit. Or yes, viruses strictly adhere to cell theory because from one virus directly arises another virus. Okay, so it's not yes.
Right. So that's immediate. But now, so my original, thought was to be like, they're not living, jump, jump, jump.
Right.
But see, there is that debate on whether or not they are because of, they have their own enzymes and they do kind of procreate in a way. Like sometimes they have their own machinery.
And here they're asking about cell theory specifically.
Yeah.
Not anyone else's maybe theory, like, well, they've got the enzymes, blah, blah, blah. So, like, I'm right with you. That's where the real, I guess, argument is right now in science. However, they're asking us about cell theory.
You're right. Okay. So maybe I'm overthinking here.
Possibly. Fine dining and breathing. Okay, so they do not directly come from other viruses. That's true.
Yeah, so that second answer choice really is true. They require an intermediate cell to replicate. They are obligate parasites.
Right. So I'm going to go with that. I think you're going with that.
Oh, really? You're going with that and not just because they're not living organisms?
Yeah.
So I wasn't overthinking. Maybe.
I'm not sure. 1, 2, 3. We got it right.
Yay! Okay, I have got to read this explanation.
Okay, go for it.
Okay. Viruses either go through a lytic or lysogenic cycle to reproduce, but both of these cycles require a host cell. Okay, nice. By themselves, viruses cannot reproduce and undergo metabolic functions to act as a biological unit. Okay, so they're not alive.
Mm-hmm.
Viruses do not strictly adhere to cell theory because viruses do not directly come from other viruses. They require an intermediate cell. They just read the answer choice again.
Yeah.
I wanted them to explain to me why the MCAT wants me to know that so maybe they just want us to know that there is a debate about viruses.
Well, there is, but according to cell theory specifically, the only thing in there that, like, cell theory doesn't say that, like, if something is living or not, like, that's not a part of cell theory, that it's like that the thing is living or not.
All living things are comprised of cells.
Well, right.
Okay.
But not that cells are living things. That's technically not in cell theory. So if they were saying, like, are viruses living things? It's like, well, maybe not, but that's not what cell theory talks about. But cell theory does talk about that, like, a cell, or in this case a virus, comes from another cell. So a virus would come from another virus.
Oh, it's like directly one of the tenets, too.
Right.
Okay.
Viruses technically come from cells. So, like, they can't make themselves. They have to go through in the intermediate.
Oh, that totally disproves that viral, like, living argument.
Right.
Because one of the main tenets of cell theory is literally, okay, wow.
Yeah.
That's great.
The day that a virus replicates itself, though, adios, folks.
Oh, adios, folks, already. I mean, their mechanisms for, outstepping host defenses, oh my goodness.
It's scary.
Like, can we talk about how HPV survives in, like, the nervous system in its lysogenic state until it decides to pop out when we're stressed and all that? Like, talk about a virus adapted to its host.
Yeah.
Do we want to real quickly define lytic and lysogenic?
So you taught me this.
Yes.
Just recently. So lysogenic, I remember because the virus is lying down and taking a little rest. Lysogenic, lying down, is when the virus is, so for instance, like if you have herpes simplex virus, it's when it's dormant and it's lying down, lysogenic. And when it is lytic, I don't have a good mnemonic for that, but when it's lytic is the opposite. Yeah. And it is active, it's out doing its bad stuff, typically on your upper lip.
Yes, that is a very good example.
Right.
Yep, and perfectly explained.
All right, next question. Rapid growth of cells is observed in tumors. One hypothesis of rapid tumor growth is that the creation of new cells uses old cells only as a scaffold to promote rapid growth, similar to how crystal solids form. In this hypothesis, new cellular material is not created from pre-existing cells. First, a new nucleus of a cell attaches to the pre-existing cells, followed by the formation of cytoplasm, and lastly, a cellular membrane forms around the cytoplasm nucleus complex. This process can only happen if there is a pre-existing lattice network of cells that can function as a site of nucleation. So, did they even really give us a question?
Nope.
Okay, so they give you 4 answers. Answer choices are: this hypothesis is not supported by cell theory because new cells are not created from older pre-existing cells. This rapid growth hypothesis is supported by cell theory because all living things are made of cells. This rapid growth hypothesis is supported by cell theory because the basic unit of life is the cell. Or this hypothesis is not supported by cell theory because cell walls are required to grow new cells. So that last one is not right.
Right.
Because it does not have to do with cell theory, cell walls. They don't mean anything. I do not think that this is supported by cell theory.
Right.
So I would say that the correct answer would be this hypothesis is not supported by cell theory because new cells are not created from older pre-existing cells.
And they say, in this hypothesis, new cellular material is not created from pre-existing cells. They told us the
Yes.
answer. It was one of those.
So this whole thing is just like it kind of grabs a bunch of material and then just forms new cells. That's weird.
Yeah, I'm thinking, so there's a postdoc in my lab that is working on some viral proteins and their role in both inducing and then kind of going against the induction of cancer. So there's like a couple of HPV, I think, viral proteins like E6, E7, E2, and E6 and E7 cause cancer, and E2, like they help overrun those checkpoints in cellular division, and then E2 kind of keeps the other 2 in check. And so her research is on this, and she was showing me some pictures of some different cell morphology, and when they are cancer cells, they do not stretch out as much, so they don't have like a regular cellular shape.
Right.
And they do seriously just like one on top of the other, like very small. And you can almost imagine that nucleation pattern kind of happening. Like not even worried about forming an actual cell, like doing everything out of order. Like that makes total sense to me.
All right. Okay, next question. A 19th century scientist investigates cell growth by placing boiled broth in one Erlenmeyer flask and non-boiled broth in another flask. The scientist covered both flasks so that air could not enter the flasks and observed the flasks for 2 weeks. Neither flask grew any biological matter. From this, the scientist concluded that abiogenesis, or spontaneous generation, was an invalid theory. Select the best evaluation. Okay, so since no colonies of cells grew in either flask, the conclusion is a valid conclusion because cells can only grow from other cells. Okay, I like that one immediately.
Yeah.
It's an invalid conclusion. No. Invalid. No. What about the other one? So since no colonies of cells grew in either flask, the conclusion is valid because spontaneous generation predicts that the cell should grow spontaneously. No. So it's that first one. Since no colonies of cells grew in either flask, the conclusion is a valid conclusion because cells can only grow from other cells.
Now, wait a second. I'm not quite sure that first one is the only possible answer here.
Okay, explain your thinking.
Okay. So the other one that I thought of was the conclusion is an invalid conclusion because living objects often require air to grow, regardless if their origin was spontaneous or not.
Okay.
No. I'm sorry. The origin spontaneous immediately takes it out. But what I was thinking was like, I don't know here.
So I
agree with you.
gonna go with
It's
this.
the
1, 2,
first
3. Oh, I was wrong. Okay.
Oh, wow.
Predicts that cells should grow
So that was
spontaneously.
the answer. Okay. So 2 weeks is more than enough time for cells to begin growing aerobically or anaerobically. Aerobically or anaerobically. No conclusion can be made about how the cells actually grow by this experiment. This experiment is very similar, yes, to one of Pasteur's experiments, where the experiment was only able to negate, not prove. Oh my goodness gracious. We made one of the cardinal sins of science. We assumed we could prove something with an experiment.
Oh.
Oh my goodness.
Dang.
Yeah. So I like that answer even more now. So let's read the rest of it. The difference between this experiment and Pasteur's experiment is that Pasteur allowed spontaneous generation conditions to exist by allowing air into the flask. In other words, Pasteur's experiment negated the possibility that spontaneous generation was the mechanism of cellular growth because the broth was exposed to the air, which was thought at the time to promote spontaneous generation, yet no cells grew in Pasteur's flask. So he didn't prove that the growth happened because of one reason or another, but he discounted the thought that spontaneous generation was what brought about any growth in the beginning.
Right.
In the first place. So the conclusion from the question is invalid. The conclusion from this question is invalid?
Is an invalid. Yeah, this is Khan Academy once again,
Okay.
not checking their spelling.
Because the experiment could not confirm or deny if the origin was spontaneous or not. But it did suggest that the lack of cell growth could be because of the lack of oxygen. So yeah.
Okay.
And so this is another one where experimental design is incredibly, incredibly important.
Right.
They want to test us on that over and over again.
Okay, last question. The following is a graph of growth from a newly discovered species. What can be concluded from the graph? So we have time on the x-axis from 0 to 3.5 hours. And then on the y-axis, we have number of cells measured in 10 to the third per unit. So it goes from 0 to 150. So that would be from 0 to 150,000 cells. So we see about like no cells basically for like an hour and a half, and then an exponential curve up till 3 hours where we have about 125,000 cells. So what can be concluded from the graph about this new species? That this species quintuples the number of cells every hour. In this species, cells must come from other cells. All living organisms, including this new species, are composed of cells, or the new species grows in colonies that promote rapid expansion in cellular population. Okay, so we cannot prove that. We cannot so all living organisms, including this new species, are composed of cells.
That's the only thing we can say with confidence, but
That's just part of cell theory.
yeah,
We don't know that from this graph, though.
Yeah, and B and C are basically the same answer.
Right. So this species quintuples the number of cells every hour.
If I'm looking at 2 to 3, hour
Okay.
2 to 3, I go from 25 to 125.
That's quintuple.
So yeah, times 5. So from 1 to 2, that's about 5.
It looks like
times
5 to
25.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe that one.
I like that. We got it right.
Nice.
Okay, so that was just looking at the graph, being able to read it correctly. Also taking in the clue that they gave us little dots at specific hours that just
Yes.
happened to be on multiples of 5 of each other.
Yeah.
Very cool. Strong work, gang.